This is a hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we are hearing the testimony of Sir Oliver Robbins, at our request, for him to explain the circumstances of Peter Mandelson's appointment and security implications of it, and his role in what happened next, and in recent days what has happened in relation to leaks and so on. I think that it's very important that we hear from you. We heard from the Prime Minister yesterday, and thank you very much for appearing. I know it must be a very difficult time for you personally, and we are very grateful to you for coming in.
Thank you, Chair.
We're hoping that you're going to feel a bit freer to give fuller answers to us than you did on the last occasion you appeared in front of us on the 3rd of November, or in your letter of the 16th of September, when you clearly told us the truth, but you only told us part of the truth. And it's a little bit like, saying I had to run to work today, but not saying that you were chased by a bear. It reminded me of when I was a criminal barrister, and the importance of the oath being that you had to tell the truth and the whole truth. We're not going to ask you to swear on the Bible or anything like that, but I think that it is important that we do get the whole truth today, and I don't intend to kind of dwell on previous issues apart from just to say that now, because what I'd like to do is just to move on to where we are now and what the questions are. And I think what I'd like to do is perhaps ask you to walk us through what the situation was when you appeared in the Foreign Office as Permanent Undersecretary. What was the state of play, and in particular, what was the status of Peter Mandelson, and what needed to happen next, and what did you need to do in order to ensure that happened?
Thank you, Chair. And I know this sounds formal and maybe even a bit unlikely, but thank you very much for the opportunity today to come and speak to you about these matters. As you say, it has been a difficult time, leavened slightly by it being my birthday yesterday.
Yes, all that.
So thank you for the opportunity to set things out. I won't go on at length, but I think there are three important framing points I need to make. Firstly, as you say, when I walked into post as Permanent Undersecretary on the 20th of January last year, I wasn't walking into a vacuum. I arrived to a situation in which a due diligence report had been undertaken into Mandelson by the Cabinet Office, assessing the reputational risks and his fitness for office. The Prime Minister had then presumably taken advice on his fitness for office. The name had been submitted to the King as Minister's recommendation. The Prime Minister had made an announcement that Mandelson was his nominee without caveats. The British government had sought agrément, the formal diplomatic process for a host government accepting a nominee from the US government, and that had been obtained before I arrived in post. He'd been given access to the building. He'd been given access to low classification IT. And from time to time, for case-specific issues, he was being given access to higher classification briefing. So I'm afraid I walked into a situation in which there was already a very, very strong expectation, and you will have seen the papers released already under the humble address, that coming from Number 10, that he needed to be in post and in America as quickly as humanly possible. The very first formal communication of this to my predecessor from Number 10 Private Office being that they wanted all this done at pace and Mandelson in post before inauguration. So that's the situation I faced.
I'm sorry, so there is paperwork about that, and that presumably will be disclosed to Parliament?
It already has been, Chair.
That has been disclosed.
That letter from Number 10 Private Office is already in the disclosures made. There's nothing improper about it, but that's the context I walked into. So I'm afraid what that translated into for my team in the Foreign Office, and certainly the handover briefing I was getting as I arrived at post, was what I felt was a generally dismissive attitude to his vetting clearance. The focus was on getting Mandelson out to Washington quickly. Despite this atmosphere, an atmosphere of pressure, the department completed developed vetting to the normal high standard. Because the vetting process is not there to determine fitness for office or reputational risk, it's there to protect national security. And the Prime Minister had already made those judgments.
I'm so sorry to cut across you. We will get on to that, but can I still want to just take it in stages if it's all right with you.
Yes.
Because what I'd like to do is to ask you about, we hear about the circumstances, the announcement, the press release, the King having agreed, the Americans having agreed, the letter to him, congratulating him on it, the access. But it was all subject to vetting. And the question I want to ask is, what kind of pressure additional to that were you put under in relation to the vetting?
Thank you, Chair. And before I answer your question, which I promise I will, it was not I'm afraid I don't think at the point of his appointment and 4 days thereafter it was actually a given that he would be vetted. Again, if you look at the documents submitted under the humble address, there is no stipulation from number 10 that he should be vetted. The welcome that was sent to him immediately afterwards doesn't say welcome to the Foreign Office subject to vetting. The announcement put out on the 20th of December says that he will be out early in the new year. It does not say subject to vetting.
The contract does, though. The contract of employment.
The contract issued to him after he was vetted says that he must maintain his clearance. So did mine. Okay. That is an absolutely standard stipulation. But nothing about his appointment actually, as far as I've seen in writing, stipulates it. There was then a debate between Cabinet Office, FCDO, about how to make sure that he is sent out to post with the appropriate clearance. And that took several days. And a position taken from the Cabinet Office was that there was no need to vet Mandelson. He was a member of the House of Lords. He was a Privy Councillor. The risks that attending his appointment were well known and had been made clear to the Prime Minister before appointment. Now, in the end, the FCDO insisted and put its foot down. I understand my predecessor had to be very firm in person. But that was a live debate at the point of announcement, and I think it's important to make that clear to the committee.
And that, again, should be minuted. Those discussions should have been minuted, and it should be they should be part of the humble address disclosure.
Well, given your absolutely understandable focus on scrupulous accuracy, that's before my time, but I'm sure there will be papers.
Yeah. And who was the debate between? Who in the Cabinet Office? Do you know?
I don't know for sure. The briefing I had on arrival was that there had been a position taken from the Cabinet Office that, as I say, some of Mandelson's status meant that vetting might be unnecessary, and that had been a discussion for several days after the press notice. It had been resolved before Christmas and resolved in the FCDO's favour. And I only mention it, Chair, because I think to say now that it was always clear that his appointment was subject to vetting is something that the committee should consider whether that's something they need to take more evidence on.
So before we move on, then, you're not sure who it was in the Cabinet Office, but can I ask this: was it a politician or was it civil servants?
I don't know. I was not in post at the time. All I understand is that there was a live debate. I think at official level, but I couldn't swear to
Okay. So, additional to that, was there other pressure put on you or put on the Foreign Office?
I think throughout January, honestly, my office, the Foreign Secretary's office, were under constant pressure. There was an atmosphere of constant chasing. When will this?
Daily phone calls.
I couldn't say for certain daily, but I mean certainly very frequent, from private office to private office. Has this been delivered yet? Never any interest, as far as I recall, in whether, but only an interest in when.
So when you say private office to private office, you're saying private office of number 10?
Yes, I am.
And who are we talking about there then? Are we talking about Elsa Tarry?
I'm not going to say, Chair. I may no longer be a civil servant, but I didn't come here today to scapegoat other civil servants. I came here to make sure the committee understood the circumstances.
No, I understand that, but I also want to know who the source of this is. And I want to be able to get as much evidence as possible to be able to identify who the source of the pressure was. I mean, from what you know, let's see if I can ask you this way. from what you know, what was the source of the pressure?
Well, I've said I think that the vector I was most conscious of was from number 10 private office. And
the number 10 private office is not sort of is a means by which others ensure that things happen. So behind the number 10 private office, who are we talking about putting pressure on the Foreign Office via the private office?
Thank you for asking it that way, Chair, because that's the reason I do not want to name other officials in number 10. I think that the private office would only have been feeling this pressure themselves if they were under pressure.
Yes. Did you answer the question?
I don't know.
So we do know that Morgan McSweeney was a protégé of Peter Mandelson's, and we know that he was very keen on Peter Mandelson getting the job, and we know that he resigned, saying that it was all his fault, and that he had advised the Prime Minister to appoint Peter Mandelson, and took it on the chin, took the blame. So, was it him?
I'm afraid when I said I don't know, I meant it. I don't know.
Right.
I've told the committee what I do know, which is that the Foreign Office was being chased very frequently, and I don't hold the private secretaries responsible for that.
And was there any direct communication between anyone in number 10 and you?
No.
So there was no one ringing you on your mobile phone or WhatsApping you or sending you any messages?
No.
And your phone is presumably something which has been handed in as part of the humble address and will be able to be investigated?
Certainly will.
I'm just told that once someone has finished being a civil servant, that their phones are wiped and that they're reused. So could you just give us an undertaking to make sure that doesn't happen?
My phone for the relevant period was downloaded before I left government.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So it's private office to private office, nobody contacting you directly. But again, as far as you're aware, a record was taken of the contact between private office and private office.
I'm sure there are records of interactions between us. I couldn't swear to what those are or how many of them there are, but you'll have to ask the government that, I'm afraid.
No, but if it's a private office, it's your private office. And so number 10 is contacting your private office, and your officials are telling you, we've had another phone call, we've had, in what other way were you getting pressure?
I'm talking, Chair, remember, I'm talking about the whole of January here,
Yes.
the first 3 weeks of which I was not in post.
But were you actually in the Foreign Office,
I
even though you weren't in post?
I had a handover week the week before I took up the position,
right?
Where Philip told me a bit about the job, and I sat in a room some distant from his and read a lot of papers.
Did he tell you that you were going to get a lot of pressure?
He described to me the steps and the atmosphere that I've described to you.
Yes. Okay. So during the 2 weeks in January that your office is getting pressure, we've heard about phone calls. What else is there? Are there emails as well?
I don't think so. And this is I think the natural thing in many ways, which is that a private secretary wanting to know what's going on, feeling under pressure themselves to deliver, is ringing up and saying, where are we on this? Can we make it happen? Can you deliver? Get on with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's right, isn't it, that there should be official records kept accurately, and information should be handled as openly as possible within the legal framework according to the code. So there should be a record of all the phone calls that are made.
I think if the modern civil servant made a record of every phone call that they received, they would do nothing else, Chair. So I doubt there's a record of every phone call. I'm sure there is a trail that explains that there was a regular contact.
I thought that genuinely civil servants couldn't buy a cup of coffee without making a record of it.
I don't seem to be able to buy a coffee without someone following me down the road, Chair. So
yeah, it'll pass. But seriously, it is part of the code, isn't it, to keep accurate official records and handle information as openly as possible within the legal framework. It's a really important part of this to keep records. And I hear what you say, not every phone call, but phone calls from number 10 saying, get on with it. We want to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States is an important phone call, even if it does happen every day.
It is, but if it's not telling the department anything new, then there might be no need to record it each time that you receive it.
The need to record it is to show the extent of pressure that the Foreign Office was being put under by number 10.
Well, as I say, I think that when you take evidence from the government, they will be able to describe that period to you. And I've tried to do my best to do so when I was only in post for 1 week of January.
Okay. Can I ask you this? So let's move on to the 28th of January, when UKSV recommended that developed vetting be denied, and that Peter Mandelson, they identified, was he was a man of high concern. You recognise those two phrases as being applied to Peter Mandelson?
I don't actually, Chair, but we can come on to that in a second.
Okay. Well, we understand that those two things were what UKSV concluded about Peter Mandelson. Now, any questions I ask you about this now are not to be interpreted as questions about what is the content of that vetting. Right? I don't want to hear about what was in it. I want to know what happened as a result. But what I want to ask you is, you had a meeting with the Director of Security, Ian Collard, and I understand that you're saying that he presented you with the findings. You didn't actually read them yourself.
That's correct, Chair. Perhaps I could describe this meeting to you if that would help.
And again, is there a note of it?
There is a note of the decision. The meeting itself, of course, involved the team describing to me some of the issues and the way in which they proposed to manage them. It wouldn't have been appropriate to record that in detail. The decision of what we agreed we would do and the ways in which we would manage it is recorded and is available in the Foreign Office. And
that record is part of, if I can call it, a DV bundle. So there's the UKSV paperwork, and then there's paperwork from the Foreign Office, and so those two, there's a part 1 and part 2, and so it's part of that bundle, but it isn't, the record that you're talking about is not a freestanding document.
I think I know what you're driving at, but may I describe this in my own words, Chair? There has been a good deal of misunderstanding about this process, if I may say so. For the Foreign Office and for several other departments, UKSV does not fail a candidate. Nor does the department, no I know, and apologies Chair, but others have. And nor does the Foreign Office overrule UKSV. The relationship between the two is set out in guidance and has been set out to this committee and in Parliament. And so the outcome of the vetting process is what is decided by the Foreign Office on the basis of the UKSV findings and our own assessment of the risk and whether we can manage them. And so what the meeting I had with the Director on the 29th of January, it was an oral briefing. No documents were presented to me, nor did I particularly expect them to be. I have never seen a UKSV document. I was briefed that UKSV considered Mandelson a borderline case and that they were leaning towards recommending that clearance be denied, but that the Foreign Office's Security Department assessed that the risks identified as of highest concern by UKSV could be managed and or mitigated. I was also told that the risks did not relate to Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and that I was told that UKSV acknowledged, I don't know in what way, but acknowledged that the Foreign Office might wish to grant clearance with appropriate risk management. So we talked about what that appropriate risk management might be, and the grant of clearance, the record of that decision, internal, records the grant of clearance and also the mitigations.
I don't really follow why you wouldn't know the contents of the UKSV and their concerns, or even that they had said that there was high concern about Peter Mandelson. If you can, I don't understand how you can not know that if you are considering what the mitigations are. You can't have the mitigations without knowing what the problem is.
The risks were explained to me, but I have not seen the underlying documentation. That's what I'm saying, Chair.
So
perhaps, sorry, I mean, that obviously strikes members of the committee as odd, but
well, yes.
In all my years as a civil servant, many of them as a relatively senior one, I have never seen a UKSV document, other than the ones I filled in myself. And that doesn't surprise me. The government makes very clear in public guidance that for anybody to be briefed outside the vetting security process, for anybody to be briefed on the information into or findings of a UKSV process has to be for, I think I quote, wholly exceptional circumstances.
And this is a wholly exceptional circumstance, surely?
No. What I was told was absolutely within normal parameters of a set of findings from UKSV and the department assessing those. They were issues that the department felt it had long experience and deep capability of assessing and coming up with a plan for how those could be managed and clearance granted. That is not unusual in this process, Chair. It was unusual, I admit, that I was briefed on it. I wasn't surprised to be briefed on it given the prominence and the profile of the case, but the underlying interaction between UKSV and the Foreign Office and the decision-making process was entirely standard.
When you were given your oral briefing, you claimed that you were given the impression that Peter Mandelson was a borderline case and not a case of high concern or one that was whereby the UKSV was recommending denial of vetting.
That's correct. I was told, let me be completely precise, I was told, I think, that UKSV were leaning towards recommending against, but accepted it was a borderline case.
Okay.
And I think it's important to say this, when we're dealing with documents and releases of documents, inevitably things look quite black and white. My understanding is, the personnel security team in the Foreign Office and the vetting team in UKSV are interacting about literally hundreds of DV cases a day. We are a DV by default department, as you know, Chair. That means we have thousands of people who hold DV in the Foreign Office, many of whom are renewing their DV, new people arriving requiring DV. We are one of the biggest customers for DV services.
And I hear you, I understand this, but this really was exceptional. I mean, there isn't any other DV case where you were getting daily phone calls from number 10. I mean, this was different. You were being put under pressure. And I just find it, if you don't mind me saying, remarkable that you got completely a different view of what UKSV were saying about this than that which I understand is written down.
Well, I respectfully, I disagree, Chair. The department's security team are extremely professional, experienced people. They have a live dialogue with UKSV. The risks that were identified were ones that they felt they understood well and could manage.
Okay. Was there anything in the DV that was not already in the public realm? Was there anything that had been identified that we didn't already know, all of us?
As I wrote to you this morning, Chair, and I'm sorry if this begins to come back to your opening remarks, but I may no longer be an official, but I don't think I can open that box. This system absolutely depends on candidates for vetting knowing that the government will completely respect the confidences that they share.
Yeah, no. So don't tell me. Okay. So if there was anything that wasn't already in the public realm, just tell me that there was something that wasn't already in the public realm. Don't tell me what it was. Just tell me, oh, yeah, there was something else, but sorry, can't tell you.
I'm afraid I'm not prepared to do that, Chair. What that leads to is, of course, then an absolute storm of questions as to what that issue was.
I'm not going to ask you a storm of questions. That's going to be my last question. I'm going to move on to my last question after this.
I'm sorry, Chair. I trust you. I'm not sure that the whole of the rest of the world will hold off from wanting to know.
Okay, all right. And where is the note of these meetings?
The decision that was reached in the meeting was recorded the following day.
And your thought process and the reasons that you decided what you did, you didn't make a separate note of?
No.
So it's all on the DV documents?
It's the outcome of the consideration by the Foreign Office is recorded in the decision that was issued the following day.
And apart from your meeting with Ian Collard, did you have a meeting with anyone else about before you made the decision that you came to about giving Peter Mandelson clearance subject to mitigations?
No.
So it was just that meeting with Ian Collard, no other meeting?
Right.
And the decision was made there and then? The
decision is always formally made by the personnel security team. They are this is a bit of jargon, although it's also plain English. They are the decision maker for the Foreign Office, and so the minute recording the Foreign Office's decision says ESND have decided to grant clearance.
And was there anybody else in that meeting apart from you and him?
I think at least one member of Ian's team was there, but I couldn't swear to it.
And would their job be to take a minute of the discussion?
I hope not, Chair, because the issues we discussed should not have been recorded at the tier of classification that would be available.
Even if it was then put into the DV documents?
They will have recorded the decision back in the secure system we use with UKSV.
And did you tell anybody once you'd made that decision?
Did I tell anybody that Peter Mandelson had been granted DV clearance?
Yeah.
I'm sure I will have told probably the Foreign Secretary and probably number 10, but to be honest, it will have been implicitly clear within a day or two anyway, because we'd always said he would not be sent on posting to Washington without it.
Get it. You're getting a lot of pressure. You're getting maybe daily phone calls. So surely somebody, you would have crossed your mind, I'm going to ring X, who you're not prepared to tell me who it is, and tell them, for heaven's sake, get off my back, I've cleared him.
Honestly, Chair, it's plausible, but I don't remember doing so.
It's likely more than plausible that you would have rung somebody up immediately you'd made the decision and told them you'd made the decision.
It's also possible that I'm capable of a bit of obstinacy, and people ring me all the time asking me.
I can understand you. I get the vibe, but nevertheless, I do not believe that you didn't tell someone, and you know where I'm going next. Where's the note? Where's the note of the phone call, and who did you speak to tell them that the decision had been made?
I don't think I made such a phone call, and if I did, it would have been simply to share the outcome of the process, which is that DV had been given.
Right, so you might have discussed it with someone else and got them to tell whoever it was that was pushing the Foreign Office as to what had happened.
It's possible, but Chair, honestly, I am trying to do my best to help you, but I think this is a bit of a red herring. Within hours, as the humble address pack makes clear, Peter Mandelson was written to with a contract of employment and a posting letter to Washington, which the Foreign Office had always said he would only get once he passed DV. So it was absolutely clear. Not only that, within minutes of us recording our decision to grant DV, Peter will have received a DV certificate, and it's entirely possible that Mandelson himself will have then told people it's been granted. I don't think I felt under any obligation to tell anybody.
I think you are under an obligation to keep accurate minutes and notes of decisions that you make, of actions that you take, and your reasoning. And I think that it's quite clear from the Civil Service Code that it is your responsibility to keep accurate official records and handle information as openly as possible within the legal framework, that you must not be influenced by improper pressure from others, that you must not ignore inconvenient facts or relevant considerations when providing advice or making decisions, and that in order to be able to cover yourself, never mind anything else, given that's what the ministerial the code says, that you would take a note in order to make it clear that you were not subject to undue pressure, that you were not ignoring inconvenient facts, that you were behaving properly. But it doesn't look like there has been any notes about any of this.
Can I make 2 points? I've been a civil servant for a quarter of a century. I could recite the code to you, and I believe it, along with probably the Book of Common Prayer, it's one of the two things I kind of can hold in my memory, and I've abided by it. And you will find, when the records are finally opened, you will find record of the decision. It is clear. What I am saying to you is that whilst there was an atmosphere of pressure, the department rigorously followed the process. And we did so, frankly, as I understand it, despite some in government believing it was not a process we ever needed to follow. And I just ask you to reflect for a second. I don't think, my life might have been considerably easier over the last 2 or 3 days if I wanted to come to this committee and said I was put under such pressure I just agreed to it. But that wouldn't be true. I was given a set of serious reflections on the risks raised by a bunch of professionals who had come across these risks before and thought the Foreign Office could manage them well, and at least the way I was briefed, that was a position that was implicitly understood by UKSV. We then recorded that decision and we put in place the mitigations, and clearance was granted.
Because again, the code does say that if you believe that you're being required to act in a way that conflicts with this code, you should speak to your line manager, which leads me to this. I mean, your line manager would be Chris Wormold, presumably. But is it right that you say that you never told him? You never told him about any of the difficulties that you were facing, any of the pressure you were facing? In fact, you didn't even tell him that UKSV had said that Peter Mandelson was a person of high concern and that developed vetting be denied.
As I say, whilst I think the department felt under pressure, we were proud of the fact we'd not bowed to that pressure. Therefore, I didn't have a complaint to make to Chris because I was confident that we were handling it well. I should say on a lighter note, Chair, I think by the time clearance was granted, I'd not yet had my introductory meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, so these were very early days.
Yeah. And it wouldn't be part of your meeting with him to say, oh, well, we had a few wrinkles, but it doesn't matter, it was sorted out. Or, UKSV were pushing in one direction, but the Foreign Office have, through putting conditions on Peter Mandelson, covered that. Or you wouldn't have been tempted to say that to Chris Wormold, you wouldn't have been tempted to say that to Morgan McSweeney, you wouldn't have been tempted to say that to anyone.
Absolutely not, Chair, because my understanding of custom, practice and guidance is that the decision-making within the box of the vetting process must remain entirely confidential.
But if you've put it in any of the ways I've suggested, you would not have been disclosing any of the content of that DV. You would just have been disclosing the fact that it had been passed, but that there had been difficulties. And surely that does not disclose anything of substance. That's all process.
But I think it would have been, Chair, me just trying to shift responsibility onto others. It's absolutely clear the Permanent Undersecretary is responsible for the security of the department. You know well from the work of this committee, the Foreign Office is the most attacked government department, as attacked as the rest of government put together. That was a heavy responsibility for my tenure as Permanent Undersecretary. If I started sharing that burden with others and saying, this was a bit of a tricky one, but I think we can manage. What I'm doing is I'm offloading that responsibility. The responsibility ultimately was on me, and I carried it out rigorously and to the best of my ability.
If you widened the circle, or if you made notes, or if there had been more paperwork, then wouldn't those have been disclosable under the Freedom of Information Act? And isn't the only reason that we even know that the UKSV had said that developed vetting should be denied is because of the humble address? Otherwise, we would never have known. And there would never have been any paperwork, and there would never have been an audit trail, and there would never have been a trail of decision-making. We would never have known.
I think if you're saying to me, excuse me, Chair, I think I'm following you, but that vetting documents are outside the Freedom of Information Act, that's absolutely true. And I think it's an incredibly important tenet of how the system works.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying
you cannot have a system in which the hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates for vetting think that at some point in the process, a line manager's line manager's line manager, who they've never met, might choose to see their boss and say, this was a bit of a tricky one, the UKSV documentation sort of erred against, but don't worry, I managed through. I think that would be a breach of trust.
That's not, we support you completely on this. That's not a problem. The problem is the process. The problem is that if there had been more paperwork, if you had discussed it with anyone, then it might have come out that there had at least been, to put it as mildly as possible, a wrinkle.
Excuse me, Chair, you're a lawyer and I'm not, but my understanding of the Freedom of Information Act is it's about the exemptions, if they're available, are about the nature of the material, not about the type of communication. So I think if I had gone to somebody else, talked about a vetting issue, and that had been recorded, it would have been covered by the same exemptions. My point is I should never have done it, and I didn't.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll pass on to Sir John.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, I think are going to move on to other aspects, but I just want to probe a little bit further on one or two of the answers you've already given. You've described to us the situation when you arrived in post, the extent to which various steps had already been appointed, due diligence, the approval of the King, the obtaining of agreement. Were you surprised that all of those had been completed without the vetting process having been done?
Thank you, Sir John. In the narrow sense, I wasn't surprised because I've been following the news. So when I arrived in post, I knew perfectly well that the Prime Minister had made his appointment, that it had been announced. And of course, then in my handover with Philip, he told me about agreement and the other steps that you mentioned. As I look back, whilst the Foreign Office didn't see it as I understand it at the time, I am also completely unsurprised by Simon Case's advice to the Prime Minister of November 2024 that if he wished to make a political appointment, it would be the safest course to achieve security clearance before making the announcement. And I think, had I been in post, Philip will speak for himself, maybe he did, but had I been in post at around that time, that's what I would have advised as well.
So you think it should have been obtained before those steps were taken?
I think, as others have said publicly in the last few days, this is unusual because most people appointed to ambassadorial roles already hold clearance.
Yep.
But that's a very, very sensible position to be in, and it's what I would have advised in this case too.
Thank you. And you've also described...
I should say, I mean, in the American context, John, as you may well be aware, it's a particularly sensitive issue because the United States government is very hot on the clearances people hold, and so it would have been a sensible precaution.
And actually, had approval not been granted and therefore the position had been revoked after agreement had already been obtained, would that have damaged our relations with the United States, in your view?
I think it certainly would have had. Yeah, I mean, I think it would have damaged them. Yes, Sir John. I mean, the process of getting agreement was taken at quite some pace and was delivered, I think, still technically just by one working day by the Biden administration. I think if the nomination had changed after that point, the incoming administration may well have commented on it publicly, and it would, yes, have caused quite an issue in the relationship.
Right. And the dismissive approach of number 10, which you describe in your letter, you say that came from the fact that all of these steps had already been taken. Was there anything further which indicated to you that number 10 really didn't regard this as anything more than a formality which had to be completed?
To stay scrupulous, Sir John, nothing I can bear personal witness to, but certainly in my transition into the job, I was briefed obviously about the debate there had been about whether to vet at all, and that all added to a picture.
Thank you. Can I also ask a little bit more about the meeting you had on the 29th of January, which resulted in the decision to give DV clearance? You've said that you were briefed about the contents of the report by UKSV, but you didn't see it. Now, we understand, indeed, the government has published the template decision-making form in which there are 3 boxes at the end, a green one, an amber one which says approved but remain valid concerns, and the red one, the final one, clearance denied or withdrawn. Now, we are told that the tick was in the red box, clearance denied or withdrawn. Now, that doesn't seem to me borderline. Were you aware that the tick was in the red box?
I have, before the government chose to publish it, I've never seen a form like that. And so if I may make 2 points to John, I certainly do not recall the way in which the UKSV findings were presented to me as being that definitive. As I say, it was briefed to me that they were leaning against, I think is the phrase I remember. But
leaning against is not the same as the decision. We are told that the decision, the recommendation rather, from UKSV was clear. The recommendation was denial. It wasn't leaning, it was denial.
Well, you asked me what I heard in that meeting, and I'm trying to remember to the best of my ability. The other point, which I think in the way you've asked the question you understand perfectly well, but just in case, that form is consumed differently in the Foreign Office and in half a dozen other departments than it is in other parts of the system. Those are recommendations and not decisions. And so what my team will have done, I'm sure, is break that down, go through the specific issues that have led UKSV to their concern, and then make an assessment as to whether they can be managed. And that's what came to me.
Your team did that. The meeting you had was only with the Director of Security, so it would have been his officials who have broken it down, and he would have reported to you the outcome of that process.
Right.
And a note was then circulated afterwards saying what the decision was. Did that note simply say, it has been decided that Lord Mandelson is to be granted clearance, or did it say, despite the recommendation of UKSV, it has been decided?
I think that minute is not a minute I can properly discuss, Sir John. It's no longer, sadly, my document. And as I said in answer to the Chair's questions earlier, it's a minute that certainly would give you, the public, but also our adversaries, quite a strong sense of how we tried to manage that process.
But are you aware that anybody else other than you and the Director of Security who took that decision were aware outside that the decision went against the recommendation of UKSV?
So apologies for repeating myself, but I was told that it was borderline and that they were recommending against. I don't remember anybody at any stage saying anything different to me, certainly not about red boxes. So I'm sorry, I don't know if that answers your question. But
I'm afraid it doesn't quite.
Okay,
Essentially, my question is, you took a decision in a meeting with just one other person present. Was anybody else aware after that meeting that the decision had been to overturn or to go against the recommendation of UKSV, or was it simply reported, we've had a meeting and we've decided that he should obtain clearance?
I'm sure the Director, and sorry, I did answer the Chair earlier, I don't think it was just the Director in the meeting with me. I think there was at least one member of his team there. I'm sure they will have debriefed to some extent on the conversation, but I don't know precisely what was said.
But did you tell ministers at all, or number 10? You told them the outcome of your decision, the outcome of the meeting, but did you tell them about the recommendation made by UKSV?
No, and months later, when in the immediate aftermath of Mandelson's sacking, we were obviously thinking internally about how to respond to legitimate questions this committee and others had about that process. And my recollection is, in a way, I wasn't surprised by. The direction from number 10 was, we must make clear that these decisions were taken entirely independently of ministers and that they were not consulted other than to be told the outcome.
Edward, I think you wanted to intervene.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify the conversation that happened in the meeting discussing, presumably your Chief of Security comes to you and explains the concerns raised, but also the mitigation that he believes the department can put in place. At that point, is it a recommendation to you, or is it your judgment on whether or not those mitigations are sufficient for you to be satisfied on the granting of DV?
Good question.
I recall it as a recommendation to me, but before you read too much into that, I was accountable.
I accept that.
So that is not an attempt to say, if only they are entirely professional people. They care deeply about national security. They run one of the toughest security functions in government, given the attack we're under. I trusted their judgment and I backed it.
Okay, I totally accept that. But I just want to be clear that the advice you were given in that meeting, that conversation, was that we understand these risks, we believe we can mitigate against them, and therefore you should be comfortable making the decision to grant it, or it's our decision that it can be granted given these mitigations are in place?
Obviously, we're at a stage in this whole episode where precise words are very important, and I wish I could recall them that precisely, Mr. Morello, but I don't think that's an unfair representation.
Okay. So you've already outlined the extreme levels of political pressure that you were under to complete this process. Is there any suggestion that that pressure filtered down to the department that ultimately was making the recommendations to you? Were you satisfied in that meeting that the evidence the options that were proposed to you and the decisions that they were proposing was come to independently of the political pressure that was being exerted on you, or will they also have felt the political pressure that was on the department?
So, extremely good question, and I am very confident in answering. They are clever people, they will have been very aware of the pressure. I also have complete confidence that their recommendations to me and the discussion we had and the decision we made was rigorously independent of that pressure.
Thank you, Chair. What I want to ask, having heard everything you've given us so far, is what do you think would have happened if you denied clearance? Yeah. How would you have gone about that? Yeah. What would the impact of that be? Would it even be possible?
So maybe this is the first time, remembering back to the Chair's introduction, where I can abandon the civil servant's response of saying that's a hypothetical question. I think it would have been very difficult indeed, Mr. Carden. I mean, again, if I can walk you back to the situation I came into the post in, we had been through all of these steps very publicly, in which the Prime Minister's nominee had been put out there to the public, announced, blessed by the King, agreed by the US government. We were in receipt of formal letters from Number 10 telling us to get on with it quickly. We had engineered agrément to arrive just before the inauguration, as required by that original letter that's been published as part of the humble address response. So I'm not trying to hide from your question, but I suppose all I can do is agree with the premise that against that backdrop, the Foreign Office saying, okay, but sorry, we can't grant him clearance would have been a very, very difficult problem. And a difficult problem I would have been landing the Foreign Secretary with and the Prime Minister with. And of course, given the commentary of the last few days, I'm acutely conscious of that, and I've done the odd bit of what-if-ery myself. But I suppose, just in case this is the thrust of your question, that was not what was on my mind as we took this decision. I have spent 25 years now just as a civil servant. About half of that period, I've been in jobs that have an acute bearing on national security. I live and breathe this stuff, possibly to a fault, Mr. Carden, and I believe passionately that it's one of the jobs of the civil service, creatively, flexibly, to support ministers in protecting national security. That's what I wanted the team performing this assessment to feel, and that's the conversation that was going on in my head as I listened to their recommendations.
And so if we go back again, the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Lord Case, advised the Prime Minister to carry out security vetting prior to announcing any appointment. Why would that advice not have been followed?
Here I will take the civil servant's answer, if I may. It's a hypothetical I can't possibly have a bearing on. I
wonder why it wouldn't have happened automatically. If that was the view of the civil service, why wouldn't that advice just automatically be followed, that vetting would be gained before an announcement made?
I can only guess. The Prime Minister had received a due diligence report in which the very well-known reputational risks of appointing Mandelson were presumably made clear to him. He had advice on different options for the post. I assume he would have looked at the risks around Mandelson. And maybe he thought, look, this is a very well-known character. I'm making a risk judgment that his political skills and nous in Washington is just what this country needs at this time. And he decided there's not much more that any process can tell me ahead of me making this announcement and making this appointment. Now, as I've said earlier in response to questions, I hope that if I'd been in the system at the time those decisions were being made, first I hope that Number 10 or the Cabinet Office might have wanted to consult me. I don't think at the time the Foreign Office was consulted. And then I hope my advice would have been, that's adding unnecessarily to your risk, Prime Minister.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that Foreign Office officials granted him, Peter Mandelson, developed vetting clearance against the specific recommendation of the United Kingdom Security Vetting that developed vetting clearance should be denied. And then you've said to us that UKSV did not fail Mandelson and FCDO did not overrule their decision. I'm trying to get to is it your contention that the Prime Minister is misunderstanding the process which you followed?
I can only describe the process as I understand it, and I hope, having been Deputy National Security Advisor for 4 years, responsible for vetting and for the strap clearance process that often follows it, and then having spent a year and a bit as Permanent Undersecretary, my understanding of it is reasonably good. But also, you don't have to believe me. I mean, there are guidance documents available in the Foreign Office that describe this precisely to candidates for vetting. UKSV is a service provider, and the Foreign Office takes the decision based on its own risk assessment and whether it thinks that the risks can be managed. That's precisely what we did in this case. The outcome is the Foreign Office decision. That's a professional decision on security advice. It's not the quixotic decision of some permanent secretary who thinks he's under pressure. But in this case, the team thought it wise and prudent to take me through their reasoning.
Final question. Is the Prime Minister right to have expected you to provide him with more information on the vetting process?
I hope it's clear from everything I've said so far that I believe that's a misunderstanding and a dangerous misunderstanding of the necessity of confidentiality of the process. And I think, I've been interested, of course, over the last couple of days to read Lord Hague on this today, and David Lammy even on Saturday, the former Foreign Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, where both have said in different language that they have never had vetting issues discussed with them in all their time as a minister, and nor would they expect to. And I'm afraid that's exactly the culture I have been brought up in. It's supported by guidance. You are not supposed to share the findings and reports of UKSV other than in the exceptional circumstances where doing so allows for the specific mitigation of risk.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Edward quickly and then to Richard.
Thank you, Chair. So, Oliver, you've made clear the exceptional circumstances surrounding the appointment of Sir Peter and the amount of stuff that had happened before the security vetting process had been completed, and that it was highly unusual and not the best practice for the way that the Foreign Office likes to run things. Were there other political appointees? Did Number 10 Operation propose any other political appointees during your tenure as Permanent Secretary? And did they abide by the standard practice during that process, in that no appointment could be made until the process had been completed? And as a result of that, were you more comfortable in not appointing those people?
I think in my tenure as Permanent Undersecretary, there was only ever one other serious proposal made, and I think that was in March 2025.
What role?
Sorry?
What role?
There were several discussions initiated by Number 10 with me about potentially finding a head of mission opportunity for Matthew Doyle, who was then the Prime Minister's Director of Communications. And I was under strict instruction not to discuss that with the then Foreign Secretary, which was uncomfortable. But the context here, Mr. Morello, was, I was still in my early months in the job, but I'd already concluded, as indeed I think I gave evidence to this committee about not long afterwards, that the Foreign Office needed quite serious reform. I was in the process of talking to the top team about quite a profound restructuring involving job losses. And I found it very hard to think how I would explain to the office what the credentials of Matthew were to be in an important head of mission role when I was in danger of making very senior, very experienced diplomats leave the office. So, I mean, after a couple of, I did my duty. I looked at the forward look of available jobs. I shared with Number 10 what some of those might be. It was, to be honest, hard to find something that I thought might be suitable, but I also felt quite uncomfortable about it, and I kept giving advice that I thought this would be very hard for the office and was hard for me personally to defend. So your question, obviously, given what we're talking about today, is about the interaction with vetting. That didn't arise because Matthew was already in post in the Foreign Office as a special advisor, in Number 10 as a special advisor. And after a day or two, the idea seemed to get dropped. So I don't think, back to your question, this specific issue of a political appointee and the interaction with the vetting process came up again during my time.
Thank you.
Can I just, because there's a little bit of mounting confusion, I think, on the committee, and if it's not just on the committee, it might be with the public as well. Are you saying that UKSV didn't recommend that DV be denied? I've put in too many negatives there. Are you saying that UKSV didn't recommend that DV be denied? Are you saying that?
No, I'm trying to tell the committee what I was briefed in that meeting on the 29th.
You're saying borderline?
I was told it was a borderline case and that they leant against.
Borderline and leant against. And that's different, is it, to recommend that DV be denied?
I can only tell you the words I heard.
Said you were not aware that this box had a tick in it, the red box saying clearance denied.
Until the government published it, I've never seen a sheet like that, Sir John.
But even if you hadn't seen the sheet, you didn't know that the clear recommendation, final decision of UKSV was clearance denied.
I was told that it was a borderline case and that UKSV were leaning against granting clearance.
Sorry, Richard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Sir Ollie, for appearing before us. You've explained that a lot of these decisions were made before you were appointed as Permanent Undersecretary. And so I'm curious to know, why did Sir Philip Barton's tenure as Permanent Undersecretary conclude 8 months before it would otherwise have?
I don't know for sure. And Philip and I, of course, have talked a lot, especially in that handover week, and I remain in touch with him and am proud to call him a friend. I think it's not completely unnatural that a new government, a new Foreign Secretary, respect and accept the Permanent Undersecretary that they have in post when they arrive, but that after a while, and I don't know whether this was more Mr. Lammy or more Sir Philip, but that having eased the new government in sensibly, having helped supported them in their early months, that one side or the other suggests it's a time for a change. If you want to know more about that, I think probably you have to ask Mr. Lammy or Sir Philip.
Certainly. And perhaps the committee will be taking evidence from them or others. But according to the recollection of the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, when he was reflecting on this time last September, he recalls that Sir Philip Barton also had reservations about the appointment of Lord Mandelson. What did you know about Sir Philip's reservations when you were preparing to take over from him?
Again, I'm reluctant to speak for Philip, if I may say that, because so much of this has become so loaded and controversial. I do remember the general atmosphere in the Foreign Office when I arrived, which I think Philip probably shared, was that a number of senior appointments had been made under the new government, which might in the past, or sometimes always in the past, have been occupied by diplomats, were now going to one type or another of outsider. He may even in the back of his mind have been thinking about me as he said that. But Jonathan would have been in that category, Jonathan Powell and others. And so I think he was nervous, and certainly others who then were my senior team as I arrived in the office were nervous that this was a sort of a creep of senior diplomatic roles going to non-career diplomats. And of course it's possible that he was worried about exactly the same reputational risks that were detailed for the Prime Minister at the time he made the appointment. But that's a matter for him to talk to you about.
In that time when you were the designate Permanent Undersecretary, what conversations did you have with advisors or officials that might have led you to believe that Lord Mandelson needed to take up this role regardless of the outcome of developed vetting?
It was never put to me, I can say with certainty it was never put to me that way. I certainly did, as I hope I've said clearly to the committee, I certainly did arrive to an atmosphere where this wasn't just please get this done quickly, it was and get it done. And so that was, I think, a pretty unmistakable feeling. As I hope I've also been clear to the committee, I don't think I allowed that, and certainly the security team didn't allow that to cloud their judgment.
I just want to look at a couple of pieces of evidence. One that was released in the tranche of documents, Volume 1 of the Return to the Humble Address, and this is a December 2024 email from the Number 10 Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Ms. Terry. And she wrote on the 20th of December 2024 to Lord Mandelson, "I understand you haven't received the attached forms yet, which Morgan mentioned to you this morning, and we are here to help as needed. Why would it be necessary for the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to have a conversation with an ambassador who was about to take post about joining forms?"
I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't privy to those conversations. Sorry, get that out of the way. To try and be more helpful, I suspect the chair said in her opening questions that Mr. McSweeney and Mandelson were close. I therefore suspect that Morgan was in touch with him, congratulating him on his appointment, and then telling him he would have some paperwork to do. And all that.
More than paperwork, it was conflict of interest forms.
I agree. And of course, when I arrived in post, this was a part of the process I then had to oversee, and was an important and occasionally difficult part of the process. But all I'm trying to explain is that I suspect when a friend talks to an appointee that they're congratulating, it's, the officials will be in touch with some stuff you have to do.
Going back to the point where Sir Philip was still Permanent Undersecretary, it is reported by, I think it's Sam Coates, that the Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff, rang Sir Philip and said, in terms stronger than those that I can use before the watershed.
I think you should.
Well, I'll just say that it was just to prove it with terms stronger than that. Does that accord with your impression?
Just fucking approve it.
Does it accord with your impression when you took over from Sir Philip?
I think I recall Philip saying to me, certainly Philip's handover to me has contributed to my strong sense that there was an atmosphere of pressure and a certain dismissiveness about this DV process, which I hope I've tried already to be honest with the committee about. I don't remember Philip using those words. Also, I'm proud to say Philip's probably not the sort of person who'd report them verbatim.
Thank you.
Yes. Could I ask you, because it's come up in the evidence you gave in answer to Edward, about Matthew Doyle. I think we probably should ask you, who at Number 10 suggested that Matthew Doyle be given the post as head of mission somewhere?
I don't know what the origin of the suggestion was, and I don't know who exactly was behind it or how serious it was serious enough for the number 10 private office to bring up the head of the diplomatic service and ask for a forward look of available head of mission jobs. And that's the point at which I thought that I needed to lay down some markers.
And who told you not to tell the Foreign Secretary?
Exactly.
The number 10 private office were clear that this was so sensitive because it was about the Prime Minister's own dispositions for his own senior staff, that I should keep that to myself for now.
Did Sir Philip tell you that raise any similar incidents during his tenure? Did he tell you did he warn you to expect this kind of behaviour from number 10?
He didn't. I mean, I have been around long enough, Mr. Morello, that I remember making one or two of these calls myself as a number 10 private secretary back in the day. So, I don't want to...
You remember making calls to the head of the Foreign Office saying, can you get a job for my mate, but don't tell the Foreign Secretary?
I hope I wouldn't have used that. Well, certainly I don't remember trying to get any job for my mates.
Can you get a job? Can you help get a job for X's mates? But don't tell the Foreign Secretary.
I think it's so long ago, to be honest, I can't remember the terms of the phone call I'm recalling, but it was, I don't think it's completely surprising that the Prime Minister would be so sensitive about the way in which he was dealing with a member of his senior team, and particularly a director of communications who's in minute-by-minute contact with the media, that he would want that kept to a very, very tight group of people at the time. And to be honest, the reason it's sort of surfaced again in my memory recently is that while I did keep this on very, very tight hold at the time, I think subsequently, or maybe simultaneously, Mandelson was asked about whether there was a job that could be made available in the US network. And so I think the fact that number 10 was interested in potential diplomatic options for Doyle was probably a bit more broadly known than I realised at the time.
Afra.
Thank you. Just before moving on to the kind of main things I want to discuss, on that point that has just been talked about, when exactly were these conversations taking place?
I'm afraid I can't tell you that precisely. Sometime in March last year.
Okay. And what was the reason, in your opinion, that it didn't move forwards?
I don't know. It's as likely, I suspect, to be about Doyle's own preferences and circumstances as anything I said. I can only tell you what I said, which is that I thought this would be difficult for the Foreign Office. It was difficult for me personally, honestly, as a leader, to explain why very talented and experienced diplomats were having to leave the organisation, and people who would be widely considered to have rather fewer credentials were being put in these important jobs. So it was very difficult for me, and I explained that. I don't know what led to the idea being withdrawn.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to focus on the decision process that you went through to consider the recommendation of the UK security vetting and the ultimate decision that you made to grant security clearance. When you were considering the recommendation and the risks that were brought to you by the UK SV, in your view, did the findings materially alter the type and level of risk that had already been brought to the Prime Minister's attention?
If I may say so, Ms. Brandreth, that's a clever version of the Chair's question earlier. And what you're inviting me to do is to say, are there particular risks that were new to me? I didn't say cleverer, Chair. You're inviting me to say, were there risks that were not already known in the public domain? And I'm afraid if there's one thing keeping me sane over the last few days, is that I will defend the integrity of this process. I hope I have a reputation. If you speak to other politicians, former ministers, the 4 prime ministers I've delivered for personally, that I am a person who gets things done, who tries to deliver for ministers, get through process and make things happen. I have always seen vetting and national security as slightly different, and so I will hold to that position if I may.
Okay. You were required to make the ultimate decision to grant or to not grant security clearance. And given that, as you've said, the public announcement of Lord Mandelson's appointment had already been made in December 24, before you took up the post, given that the White House had already confirmed it would accept and that His Majesty the King's agreement had been sought. Did you feel that you were effectively left in a position where you had no option but to manage the risks or to cause a diplomatic incident?
I was very conscious that if we went through the rigour of our process and decided against granting clearance, that would have caused a real problem for the government and a problem for the country. But as I've been trying to explain, I was conscious of that without letting it influence my judgment, let alone transferring any of that atmosphere onto the people charged with actually making that assessment.
Could there have been information from UKSV that would have therefore changed your decision?
Yes, absolutely. I think the trying to hold to my comments of a few minutes ago, I can certainly imagine risks that would have been briefed to me in that meeting that my team would not have been comfortable managing, and even if they hadn't have been, I wouldn't have been. You know, the normal way in my tenure in the job in which the Permanent Undersecretary interacts with the vetting system, Ms. Brandreth, is in vetting appeals. So we have, as I've said, thousands of people who enjoy the highest level of clearance. And sadly, people's circumstances change. Sometimes they do silly things. Sometimes this is for sad reasons. And that leads to their clearance being downgraded or even withdrawn. In those circumstances, given all I've said in answer to other questions, it is the Permanent Undersecretary who is the ultimate authority on whether they retain their clearance and the person to whom those appeals come. And the reason I'm telling you that is because I hate doing it, honestly. It's one of the most emotional things I got involved with in my time in the job, because you're conscious, you're sitting there with a manila folder and a recommendation from the personnel security team that's about to shatter someone's job. And I don't say this with pride or machismo, but I have signed those papers, sometimes after hours, way into the small hours, considering them. So I take those responsibilities extremely seriously. I have been prepared to follow through on tough advice. I have even gone against advice to be more lenient where I don't think that's consonant with the vetting principles. But in this case, I didn't feel under that pressure personally in terms of my judgment.
You say that you followed due process. Would you say that the decision that you made was the same outcome, the same decision to grant clearance, if it had been any other person being considered for ambassador? For example, if it was a civil servant being considered rather than a political appointment, do you think you would have made the same judgment to grant clearance?
The framework we applied, and therefore, yes, ultimately the decision, I think I would have applied in any case that had been brought to me. The only reason I'm putting it that way, Ms. Brandreth, is, of course, this committee today and the commentary is focusing on the unusual circumstance of this being a prime ministerial appointee and a political appointee. Mandelson was also unusual in some other ways. He had had a much longer, much more senior, much more visible career than most people who came for vetting in the Foreign Office, with a wider range of contacts, risks, issues throughout his career and life. That's not unusual, but because he was a man with the longevity of career he'd had and the seniority he'd had, I think whilst the decision-making framework is the one I would have applied in any case, this was a richer picture than you would have had of a 21-year-old graduate coming in and asking for vetting for the first time.
We've talked a bit about the fact that the announcement was made prior to this security clearance being granted. If security clearance had been sought prior to the announcement of Lord Mandelson's appointment, would that have changed the judgment you made in granting security clearance, do you think?
Excuse me, may I check I'm following you? Are you saying if they had started the vetting process before announcing him, or concluded the vetting process before announcing him?
Concluded the security vetting process as Simon Case's recommendation was, prior to formally making an announcement of the appointment, would that have changed the judgment that you made in terms of granting security clearance?
Well, obviously, so we have our chronology right, it wouldn't be me making the judgment, but I'm pretty confident that Philip would have assessed the recommendations of our personnel security team in the same way I did. So I don't think, I know I'm trying to explain quite a kind of complicated context to you. The atmosphere, and that directly relates, as you're implying, to the prominence of the appointment, the timing of the appointment relative to security vetting, all contributed to the context we were working in. But my solemn belief is that the way in which we assessed the case and the conclusion we came to, we would have done the same at any juncture.
In retrospect, obviously, with everything that we know now, do you regret granting security clearance for Lord Mandelson?
I regret that this process was not done before announcement. I regret that the due diligence process, which threw up, as I understand it, serious reputational risks, didn't colour the Prime Minister's judgment in making the appointment. There's quite a lot about this situation over the last year and a half I regret. I have no regrets about the work of my brilliant team and the judgment that we came to.
But you say you regret that the announcement was made before security clearance was granted, and yet at the same time you've said it would make no difference to your decision to grant security clearance. What would you have done differently in that case? Is it that you would have then chosen to alert the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister?
I think the main distinction I'm making, Ms. Brandreth, is I think this atmosphere I've described just wouldn't have existed. So the team would have been able to do this work, the then Permanent UnderSecretary would have been able to consider it without that same sense that they were operating under this pressure and environment. And so I think the benefit for the government, for the Prime Minister, would have been that exactly the kind of responsible questions you're asking me today, some of them would not need to have been asked, because it would have been clear that the Prime Minister had wanted this clearance given before he made the appointment.
What I don't understand from your answer is that you seem to be implying that if there had been due diligence done before the appointment, then the Prime Minister might have come to a different conclusion. But if security vetting had been done before the appointment, you wouldn't have come to a different conclusion.
I'm sorry if I was unclear, Chair. Due diligence, as I understand it, was done before the appointment, and I think that has been now released in the humble address papers. What I feel sad about is that the Prime Minister's nominee went ahead despite that due diligence. And I think, look, what doesn't matter what I think. I think the Prime Minister, as I understand it, has essentially said that himself. He regrets the appointment.
Uma.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm so sorry. I was supposed to go to Abdesam first and then to Uma. I beg your pardon.
No problem. Thank you. So I have a few follow-up questions. You referenced pressure, feeling pressure from, political pressure. You also mentioned dismissiveness. So the pressure I understand in terms of the phone calls that you spoke about. What did the dismissiveness look like?
I think the my word dismissiveness comes from all the way back to a letter to the Foreign Office, which I don't blame the person who signed it, but is out there now in the public domain thanks to the humble address, which says, "Take forth the necessary arrangements at pace. We want handover in advance of the US inauguration." Now, if you wanted to convey to the Foreign Office, we want this done in a steady, measured, rigorous way, those are adjectives you could have used. But instead, the direct written pressure, you don't need to worry about what I thought at the time as a non-official. The direct written pressure was get this done and get it done before inauguration. Now, if number 10 had wanted to say, subject to the successful achievement of developed vetting status, they could have done so. And that then, I'm afraid, to me, is consonant with a press notice that says Peter Mandelson will arrive at post early in the new year. Again, it would be perfectly possible to add a note to editors which says, subject, of course, to the appropriate security clearance being granted. And civil servants have many faults, but back to the chair's original point, records and written communications and formality are important in the culture I have grown up in. And the clear written record is not, please get this done, subject to, it's please get this done.
So in the previous meeting that we had when you came to the committee, I did ask you about timescales. I asked you about whether there was sufficient time. You didn't relay this information at that meeting. You actually said that there was sufficient time. I think the transcript says, in terms of the process, I am absolutely confident that UKSV undertook the process in precisely the standard way, doing all the checks it would expect to do, and we had ample time to assess and decide on the basis of its work. So that kind of contradicts the information that you're giving there.
With respect, I don't think it does. The DV process, more column images about which have been written in the last few days than I think in the entirety of the rest of its existence, is an extremely intrusive and rigorous process. What we ensured, of our own volition, but responding to the atmosphere I've described, is that we used one of the tickets that the Foreign Office has per year to ask USV to do it quickly. Not to a different standard, but do it quickly. And that's what they did. And so by the time the assessment came to me, I was confident that the process had been undertaken in the usual way, but if you like, it's a crude analogy, but Mandelson's case had been put at the top of the queue rather than waiting its turn. And so when I briefed the committee on that 3rd of November occasion, I was able to say that the process had been followed in the usual way and that we did not feel that we were rushed, because we had rushed UKSV to get us the full rigorous work that they do, but ahead of the rest of the queue.
And just going back to when you said the decision being borderline and denied, you were not told that it was denied at any point on the 28th when the decision was made.
This is one of the most important misunderstandings. UKSV do not deny clearance in the Foreign Office. They make findings and they make a recommendation. I was told that recommendation was that they, quotes, lent against, and it was a borderline case. That's the conversation I relayed to the committee. They do not deny clearance. The Foreign Office grants or denies clearance on the basis of a hugely experienced and capable personnel security team that responds to the fact that the Foreign Office is under more threat than the whole of the rest of government put together.
Okay. And just in relation to the final decision then that you made, you've referenced in your response to AFRA that you wouldn't have made a different decision. Do you often think about the consequences of the decision that you made?
I've had plenty of opportunity over the last few days to reflect on that. And I think about the consequences of it right now, I'm afraid, for my wonderful family and for the fact that I don't seem to be able to sleep in my own home and for various other things. But I don't reflect negatively on the professionalism and the judgments of my colleagues, or I hope myself.
You also referenced that there was a bunch of professionals that explained the risks. Who were those professionals?
So the way the Foreign Office is organised, I of course don't speak for the Foreign Office today, but the way the Foreign Office is organised is that at the time, there's been a slight reorganisation since, but we had a directorate of the Foreign Office called Estates, Security and Network Directorate, broadly speaking, buildings and security. And within that directorate is a security department that focuses on all the range of security risks that the Foreign Office face, to assets, to material, to people. And within that, there is a personnel security team. And it's that personnel security team, it's laid out in internal guidance, that will assess the report from UKSV and normally will take the decision themselves on whether to grant or deny. Occasionally that gets escalated up the line, and in this case, as I've made clear, it came to me for a sense check at the end.
Do you mind if I just interrupt? Because I'm still thinking about this leaning against versus clearance denied or withdrawn. I mean, if you had been shown the documents where the box had been ticked, high concern and clearance denied or withdrawn, would you have changed your mind and decided actually UKSV were not saying that this was a borderline case and they lent against, and that they were leaning against it, but instead that they had high concern and clearance denied or withdrawn was the box that had been ticked?
Completely understandably, Chair, everybody is focused on the form. But the way I recall
there's so little paperwork in relation to this that forgive us for relying on the little bit that we've got.
Forgive me, that certainly wasn't a criticism of the committee. I'm just frustrated that the way in which it was described to me, and which on a kind of normal human being level I would expect it to be, that this was a dialogue to some extent between extremely experienced security professionals in UKSV and the Foreign Office's personnel security team who speak many, many times a day. And so, the way the conversation, I recall it, on the 29th of January, was that they had debated some of the assessments that UKSV had made about specific risks, and indeed that as that had been reviewed internally in UKSV, some of those had shifted up and down a bit. And then the Foreign Office have reached its assessment and briefed me on it. So I can understand why we are all today focused on the starkness of the form, albeit a form I have never seen. But the conversation as briefed to me was a dialogue between the two, in which clearly, I'm not trying to pretend otherwise, there was unease in UKSV, and the Foreign Office had to work out whether it could manage and mitigate that unease.
I'm going to try one more time. It does seem to me, and I don't think I'm alone, that there is a difference between leaning against and borderline and clearance denied or withdrawn and high concern. You didn't see the form. Somebody who's highly intelligent, very professional, terribly experienced, as are you, tells you, does a readout of this, doesn't say, according to you, high concern or clearance denied or withdrawn. He says something different. I mean, you accept it's different, don't you? That leaning against borderline is different to clearance denied or withdrawn, this person is high concern.
It's a form designed for UKSV's role across government. What I've tried to explain, and forgive me if I've not done so properly, is that in the case of the Foreign Office and some other departments, we're not unique in this, defence is an obvious example.
I know this.
It's not denied or withdrawn, it's a recommendation. And what matters behind the recommendation are the individual findings about the different risks. And that's what I was briefed upon, and the way in which they could be mitigated.
Okay. I'm sorry, Abdusam, I interrupted.
Yeah, it's fine. Just a few more questions. It's been reported in the media that you have been relying on Section 3 of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act as your reason as to why ministers couldn't know the reasoning behind your decision. Is that correct?
The national security vetting is not a system set up by statute. But I think, I've read some of that commentary myself, of course, I think what those voices and commentators are trying to point out is that in that piece of legislation, Parliament is implying that national security vetting is in a different category in terms of the management of the civil service from all of the other things that CRAG perfectly properly gave the executive, gave ministers complete authority over. Now, I don't recall, honestly, sort of sitting thinking, aha, I won't tell anyone anything because CRAG tells me not to. What I know is that having grown up in this system over many years, having, of course, discussed these heavy responsibilities with my predecessors, with other permanent secretaries, and having read the internal guidance about the extent to which one should share the information about UKSV findings and reports with others, I made what I hope are still a set of defensible decisions about sharing, as ministers have said to the House, only the final outcome of the vetting process.
And did you get legal advice from any lawyers at any point?
I didn't need legal advice. This is set out in guidance. It's set out in Parliament. The way in which this system works is that ministers are held entirely independently. Well, to quote Stephen Doughty, the national security vetting process is rightly independent of ministers who are not informed of any findings other than the final outcome. He said that on the 16th of September. It's a piece of briefing that we shared with the Cabinet Office and Number 10, and they approved explicitly. Indeed, my recollection is that Number 10 asked me to ensure, in the way that we briefed both the Foreign Secretary and other ministers, that we made clear that ministers and Number 10 were held completely removed from the vetting process, and so we did, because it's true.
Given the scale of the decision, this is, it's not an ordinary, you've said it's exceptional. At any point you thought you didn't think you'd need legal advice to perhaps protect you going forward?
I mean, it has crossed my mind in the last few days that it would have been quite nice if I'd sent such an email and got such a response. But the point I'm trying to make, without labouring it, is this is such an established part of the way that we operate this system. I at no point sat there and thought, this one's a really tricky one, I need to ask a lawyer. It's, we had briefed ministers accepted that position. The way in which the internal guidance is written is absolutely clear about the strict confidentiality of the box within which the vetting system operates. And I didn't think I should take it upon myself to do something that I felt, and I still feel passionately today, as I hope you can tell, risks the erosion of a really important plank of the government's defences against what I know very well, sadly no longer can help the government deal with, but know very well are a set of absolutely aggressive hostile powers who are trying to suborn the Foreign Office, its people and its information.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That's Uma.
Thank you, Chair. So, Oliver, you said you were proud you didn't bow to pressure, but of course you were our chief Brexit negotiator. You're very used to high-pressured situations, which is partly why you found yourself in one of the top civil service roles in the country. In one of your earlier answers, you referred to that you were told not to tell the Foreign Secretary about something. Would you not have exercised your judgment as a very senior civil servant that perhaps there's a time sometimes where you should be telling the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister something that is of concern, perhaps to do with matters of national security?
Absolutely. I was Principal Private Secretary to Tony Blair. I ran Gordon Brown's office. I was Deputy National Security Advisor for David Cameron. I was Brexit negotiator, as you rightly remind me, though I don't have a doctor's note today to allow me to talk about Brexit, for Theresa May. I have worked with the people who have the hardest jobs in the land for most of my career. And of course, you're absolutely right. You make, in those sorts of jobs, and as PUS at the Foreign Office, you make fine judgments every day about what to take upon yourself and what burdens to share with the Secretary of State. That actually, and one of the things I will deeply miss about this job, if I may say so, is the Foreign Office is slightly unusual in that, given the risks to Foreign Office personnel around the world, rather more of that burden rests culturally on the Permanent Undersecretary than in other departments I've worked in. I felt deeply, deeply responsible for the safety of my team in Tehran. I would check in with them twice a day. I would ask for advice on how they were doing. I am still deeply concerned about the brave, amazing Iranian colleagues we have left behind in Tehran who work for the British Embassy there. And I can't shake that off, as you can tell. But those responsibilities weigh very, very heavily on me. Of course, where it's appropriate, I bring the Secretary of State into the circle of knowledge about how I'm tackling those responsibilities and what I think is the right thing to do about them. Safety of staff overseas is a good example, if you don't mind the slight digression. I hope if the Foreign Secretary were here, she would say, we operated this system absolutely strictly. The decisions about whether to bring people home were for me. I was the employer. I would have to defend myself in court if I made those decisions wrong and aggrieved families wanted to take the Foreign Office to court. But it was absolutely right for me to let the Foreign Secretary know that we were going to be temporarily drawing down staff from X place or Y place. She needed to defend it in Parliament, and I understood that. This is different. The vetting system explicitly, in Hansard, in guidance, is different. I've always understood it that way, and I think it's for very, very good practical reasons that keep the people of this country safe.
Understood. So, Rolly, before the decision or the judgment was made not to inform the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary, or indeed it seems anyone, that Mandelson's developed vetting clearance, or the recommendation was that it was denied. Now, you're disputing that version of events, but we've seen the box of both ticks in red. Did you or your officials working for you establish whether there was any precedent for a Prime Minister being informed that a senior civil servant had failed vetting?
I know of no precedent. Sorry, excuse me. Prime Ministers and other ministers are perfectly entitled to know that people have failed vetting. As Minister Doughty said to the Commons on the 16th of September, it's absolutely appropriate for the outcome, the final outcome of a vetting process to be made clear to ministers. What I think David Lammy, William Hague, and indeed any other minister, thank you so much, that I've come across will tell you is that there is not an ongoing dialogue. Senior officials don't pop upstairs into the Foreign Secretary's office and say, this one's a tricky one. You don't do it, because the minute you do, what that does is it erodes the very principle of the system. And you don't have to trust me on this. You know, the government's documentation on gov.uk, to candidates for vetting, is that the information you provide to us is regarded as, quotes, vetting in confidence, unquote, and is only known to the vetting staff in UKSV dealing with the clearance and the personnel security team who make a decision on the clearance.
I'm not asking about the contents of it. This is the most sensitive diplomatic appointment in British government. We have seen a form where both boxes were for denied. Did you not think to check if there is a precedent where someone's been denied to then inform the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister?
I'm sorry to harp on. Peter Mandelson was not denied vetting.
The recommendation
the UKSV report, in the case of the Foreign Office and half a dozen other departments, makes a recommendation on the basis of findings. That's then assessed, and a decision is made by the department, by a capable, experienced and expert team. So I didn't think I'd better go and find out whether people who've had some particular risks highlighted in a UKSV report have then had that information shared with the Prime Minister or with any other minister, because to do so would immediately have opened up the box of the vetting system, which I hold to this hour is an important part of our national defences.
Okay. Let me pivot to a slightly different way, because the form that we've seen that you're saying you've not previously seen, both the boxes were red, where it's high concern and clearance denied or withdrawn. But you're saying that's not a failure of vetting. So, related but separate. Once the disclosure of once Bloomberg had some emails disclosed to them and the Prime Minister was going forward at Prime Minister's questions, did you not think it was worth revisiting the UKSV document or having those discussions? And/or did you ever have any discussions about withdrawing security clearance now that new information has come to light?
So on the second part of your question, it didn't arise, honestly, because with Mandelson having been sacked with immediate effect from his post in Washington, his access to classified information was withdrawn immediately. And so, although, as you will know from the public documents, it took some days or even a couple of weeks for him to leave the government's payroll, the national security risk he could, in theory, have posed was eliminated immediately. The first part of your question again, sorry?
Once the Bloomberg, that cache of emails that Bloomberg had came to light, and you knew and this is questions on judgment, and I think I asked you this last time on the transcript, and so Chris Warmold actually told us in answer to some of these questions that the due diligence has two parts. There's identification of information and then there's judgment. You knew that the Prime Minister was set to stand at the dispatch box and vouch for one of your members of staff. Yeah. You were rightly concerned with your staff's reputation, but my question to you at that time was, were you not worried about the Prime Minister being misled? Were you not worried about him misleading the House, given that you had not told him the full picture?
Yeah, I hope I've explained. I don't think that it would have been proper for me to expose what you call the full picture to the Prime Minister. I don't think I had an obligation to do that. I believe very strongly I had an obligation not to do that. What I do remember distinctly is in the immediate aftermath of his sacking as the Prime Minister's nominee to Washington, I did consider the asking for the UKSV underlying documentation. And that was discussed on my behalf with the Cabinet Office, who initially said that I needed a national security justification for reading that documentation. And that's completely consistent with my understanding of the system.
I'm sorry to sound like a broken record. Is there a record of this? Of this conversation?
I'm afraid you'll have to ask the department. The point that I'm trying to make is that then...
Is there a record of you asking? You would have thought about this and thought, I think I should look into this. I think I'm going to make this request, and these are the reasons why I'm going to make this request. Did you make a note of that?
Personally, I don't remember doing so. I'm sure there will be evidence that you could take that will stand that up. The thing I'm trying to get to, and is that actually the Cabinet Office's response made sense to me. This is a hermetically sealed box, and just because it's convenient to you as Permanent Undersecretary or reputationally timely to review this documentation, that doesn't mean you should do so. And so I think they changed their view later, and I also respect the reasons they might have changed their view. There was a lot of dialogue between the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office as to who precisely owned this risk. But what I'm saying to you is, yes, it did cross my mind, but I wasn't surprised at the immediate reaction.
Further follow-up, Chair. Sorry, there is a on-record instance of a Prime Minister being told of a senior official having their security clearance withdrawn. The Prime Minister of the day was Margaret Thatcher, and she made a written statement to the House of Commons in 1987 setting out the withdrawal of security clearance of Sir Maurice Oldfield, who was former head of MI6. His security clearance was withdrawn. Now, you're talking about processes and the rules as it stands, but how come Margaret Thatcher was able to be told that someone's security clearance had failed and then it was subsequently withdrawn, but with Peter Mandelson, all the issues arising about his security matters are not being considered in that same vein?
Even I'm afraid I do at this stage need a tiny bit of levity. I was 12, so I don't remember I'm conscious of the passing of the years, given it was my birthday yesterday, but I was only 12. The thing, the point you're, if I may say so, helpfully making is the Prime Minister was completely appropriately told the outcome of the process, is my guess. She chose to make that public, as I remember it, not from age 12, but from an amateur interest in history. There were some very particular circumstances around that case, and the Prime Minister chose to make that public. But the point is, was the system right to tell Margaret Thatcher that clearance had been withdrawn? I think that's completely consistent with what I've been trying to explain. That was the final outcome of a DV review, and it was withdrawn. The final outcome, as Stephen Doughty said to Parliament, as Yvette Cooper and I wrote to this committee, the final outcome was shared with ministers.
Riley, I'll just leave it with this. Your version of events, thank you for setting this out. You were telling us that it's borderline. The version that we are seeing shows a very clear denied and recommendation not to go forward. And those two things don't quite match up at the moment.
Sorry, was that a question?
It's a statement. Well,
it might be.
Let's move on to Edward, who I think has got a...
I just wanted to link up the questions that Uma has been asking you and something you said earlier, which was that in relation to Matthew Doyle, you had been ordered by Number 10 not to tell the Foreign Secretary. And then when you go to the Cabinet Office to seek permission to go and look at the UKSV report, you're told, no, you can't do that. I'm just wondering if there is an atmosphere created by Number 10 that these two examples speak to of don't tell anyone you're not allowed to tell, don't go looking for anything you're not allowed to look for, we'll control this is being run here. Is that in any way accurate?
Well, if I can slightly expand your question, obviously the last few days / weeks / months have left me with many reflections on how this system works. And whilst I've been trying to explain it as honestly as I can with the chair's words ringing in my ears from the start, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it works perfectly. And there are things about this whole system that, obviously looking back, if I was suddenly bureaucratic dictator, I would want to change. And I think there is a bit of confusion as to who is ultimately accountable for holding the record of clearance I think there's a bit of confusion about how ministers are briefed to speak to the Commons about some of these things. I was worried at various points in this story that the Prime Minister was being given lines to deploy publicly that the Foreign Office had not had a chance to think through and work through with colleagues. That obviously became even sharper about Thursday, sort of 9 p.m. So there are lots of things about this that I think could be improved, but the way in which I described my own role in this, I hope all I'm trying to say is I think I tried to operate the system as I understood it, and I still believe it should be operated to the best of my ability.
Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Ollie. How common is it for you to have these borderline cases of UKSV and you have to make a judgment call after not a clear recommendation?
I don't know. It's certainly not unheard of, and the disagreement can go in either direction. And I think you would hear the same from other departmental permanent secretaries that have this relationship with UKSV. But it's important that I don't know, because, as I say, the guidance set centrally on data privacy is that a line manager, let alone the head of the department, should only be involved in looking at the report of this process in exceptional circumstances where that's strictly necessary in order to manage and mitigate risk. Now, in this case, I don't think it's breaching any confidence to say, as the occupant of our most senior bilateral ambassadorial role, Mandelson's line manager was about to be me. So I needed to be aware of the mitigations that were being proposed. I needed to be an active participant in managing them. In other cases, well, in my tenure, there were no other cases like it.
And so now that the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister has suspended the ability for the FCDO to do that, what impact do you think that will have on department postings and the ability to get people into the right place?
I'm very worried about that, honestly. I'm now, sadly, a sort of informed spectator, but I'm worried about that. In my experience, there are very, very good reasons why the diplomatic service is given a degree of expert latitude over these things. The vetting system cannot be entirely one-size-fits-all. The risks that are manageable in the Food Standards Agency are different from the risks that are manageable in our embassy in Beijing. And the Foreign Office, for people to obtain vetting in the Foreign Office, our candidates very often have a broader and deeper range of international contacts and experience than most. International contacts, of course, are an area of focus for the DV process. And therefore, an expert personnel security department that can reach an informed view of how risky and significant those contacts are for a candidate for vetting, I personally, I was new to the Foreign Office, but I personally could see the justification for.
So in your view, after this review is conducted, there should be some leeway for the Foreign Office to continue to exercise some judgment over posting. It should not be entirely down to UKSV in the future.
I hope it's fair to say that among my reflections when I answered Mr. Morello on how I would change the system, this isn't one aspect of it I would change.
Okay. Was Peter Mandelson granted strap access to the highest levels of classified information?
I believe he was, and that the strap system, which, to be honest, I should be even more careful about than I have been about the DV process for, as many members of the committee will know, very, very good reasons. That is operated entirely independent even of the department. So it was clear to me he'd received strap clearance. That offered me a degree of extra reassurance, because what I've just said about the DV process and international contacts, as I understand it, is an even heavier focus of the strap process, given that that's really about the protection of our most sensitive intelligence material from hostile foreign actors. But beyond that, I can't tell you very much, because it's a yes or no from the strap authorities, not the conversation that I've been describing between UKSV and the Foreign Office.
And the concerns that UKSV would have raised during the DV process, would those same concerns been raised during the strap process, and would they have been addressed in any different way?
I'm not trying to duck your question, but I don't want to give you false information. I think if you want evidence on how the strap process works, you should probably ask the government for it. I certainly remember at the time we granted DV, that it gave us a degree of extra reassurance to know that the Strap authorities would have a fresh opportunity to take a view on some of the things that we considered in that process.
Did the intelligence services at any point share any concerns about Peter Mandelson being the appointment as the US ambassador?
I can only speak to my tenure, and the answer to that would be no.
Knowing what we do now about Mandelson's leaking of sensitive government information during his role as a cabinet minister, what steps did you take as the PUS to ensure that when that became public, there was no further risk to the FCDO? Well, that could be mitigated.
Well, obviously, pardon me, but to get the chronology straight, that allegation about Mandelson, which, again, like all of us, I should probably be careful about given there's a live Metropolitan Police investigation, was only made months after he was withdrawn as ambassador. So, as I've already explained to the committee, we took all the usual precautions of shutting down access to sensitive material at the point he was withdrawn, and that's probably the best answer I can give you.
And what actions? I mean, he's obviously had access to all that information for many months. What steps is the department or government generally taking to ensure none of that is in the future passed on?
I don't think I'm here to speak for the Foreign Secretary, but if my reading of the newspapers is right, she's looking at that issue herself, so maybe best for her to give you evidence on that. All I can say is that obviously in the aftermath of his withdrawal, and particularly in the aftermath of this Parliament's humble address, all of those communications have been looked at in depth.
And one final question. You were PUS when the press first became aware that Peter Mandelson, in their words, had failed his security vetting. How do you think that was leaked, and what do you think that says about the integrity of the UKSV process?
I'm deeply concerned about it, honestly. It probably flows from the rest of the evidence I've been giving you this morning. I think this system does not work if candidates for it don't understand that this is an entirely different category of protection. And losing that confidence, I know it's a cliche, but that trust once gone cannot be got back. Thousands of people go through this process. Thousands and thousands of documents and sensitive issues and operations depend upon it. And I am struck and saddened that within, I think, days, probably only a small number of days, of the Cabinet Office, for their own reasons, deciding to open that up, to share what they thought they'd found and their perceptions of it internally with Number 10. I'm not making accusations at anybody. It's not my business to do so. I hope they're being very rigorously investigated and the prosecutions will result, because this is a grievous breach of national security.
So you believe it was after the Cabinet Office and Number 10 had access to those documents that the press was made aware of these detailed national security vetting procedures?
I've not seen the advice that went to the Prime Minister. All I am able to do, I'm not an investigator, all I'm able to do is put two and two together, which is that the first I heard of this deep concern and briefing of it to the Prime Minister was only really hours before it appeared in The Guardian.
Fleur.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sir Ollie. I've got questions about three different aspects of the process. Going back to the very beginning, before you started, there were conversations between Peter Mandelson and Number 10. So yesterday, the Prime Minister said, "It was clear to me that Peter Mandelson's answers to my staff in the due diligence exercise, before you started, were not truthful, and I sacked him." So that sounds like it's Morgan McSweeney. But when you came into the office, did you have notes of any interview that Morgan McSweeney had held with Peter Mandelson as a part of the due diligence or even the pre-due diligence when talking about appointing him? Did you see notes of this interview that may have given you concerns that could then have influenced how you saw the vetting process continue?
No.
You didn't know about any of those?
I knew that there had been an appointment process of sorts, and that Number 10 had operated that with the Cabinet Office. But to be honest, I think I first heard the words due diligence report after he was withdrawn as ambassador.
Thank you. And then the second one is about the meeting that you held on the 29th of January about the vetting. Did you hold that meeting because it was flagged that Peter Mandelson hadn't passed? If it was a clear pass, a green tick box in the form you didn't see, would you have even held that meeting? Or did you hold the meeting because it was an ambassadorial appointment to Washington and it was Peter Mandelson?
I was asked for that meeting because I think it was a borderline case, and a particularly prominent and significant borderline case on which, perfectly properly, very sensibly, the director felt he wanted to check his reasoning and make sure that I was comfortable with it.
And is there a note to that effect? The request was that the decision was made that you should have a meeting because of these issues were going to come up?
Not to my knowledge. It was, this was Director ESND was one of the most important figures in the way I was learning how to run the department. I'd spent a lot of time with Ian already because of the heavy responsibilities that I was learning that I held as accountable overall for security. So Ian was in and out of my private office regularly, and I was pleased about that. He, I think, said to my private office, I need 10 minutes with Ollie tomorrow, the day after, in order to take him through a particular case.
A particular case? Not the particular case that you've been rung up every day by number 10 to ask about?
This is second-hand. I'm trying to help you by guessing what the conversation might have been.
All right, okay. It's unfortunate, because if there had been a note made of the decision that the putting into the diary of a meeting that was going to take place for particular purposes and with particular reasons, if there had been a note of that, then we wouldn't need to guess at the reasons for it, and Fleur would be able to get fuller answers to the questions that she's asking.
Although I should say again, apologies, Chair, none of the issues that underlie the conversation we've been having this morning could have been committed to our IT system. So, and for all I know, my diary will say that there is an appointment with Director ESND, but the office were not allowed. It would have been a serious breach for them to try and explain in that appointment in my calendar what the underlying questions were.
You can make notes to your private office, can't you, about what you're doing and why?
What was done, I think, entirely appropriately, was that the decision was recorded the next day.
Thank you. I think what we're getting to here is that when the Prime Minister was told the process was just carried out and it was passed, actually there were different layers to this process than normally happened because of the borderline case that you described. So the meeting was held because of the borderline case. You've already said to us in your evidence to us in November that one of the hardest parts of this was the Global Council shares, and that must have been part of the mitigations, therefore. So did you hold follow-up meetings about the Global Council shares, how that was going, at which the borderline case could then still have gone either way if the mitigations weren't carried out, that you were satisfied could have been carried out?
I had many discussions with Mandelson about his Global Council stake and how we manage it, not just the shares but also the relationships that he would have built up as chairman of Global Council, founder, and we had a mitigation strategy in place for dealing with those. The main prism through which I saw those, Ms. Anderson, was managing conflicts of interest, which is not, strictly speaking, a national security issue. I suppose in extremis it could turn into one, but was more about protecting, of course, I suppose, Mandelson's reputation, but potentially protecting the government and the Foreign Office's reputation against any perception that he was advantaging Global Council or its clients. And that was the dialogue I had with him, starting, I think, a couple of days after his DV clearance was given. Conflict of interest management, as I may have said to the committee when we talked about this back in November, is an iterative process. It would be a serious mistake to say all conflicts are managed, tick, let's forget about it. You have to actively manage them, so we kept coming back to it. And also, in order to give me greater confidence, with his permission, I briefed his office and his senior team in Washington to help me keep an eye on any perceptions of conflict as his term as ambassador advanced.
Thank you. And when other ambassadors are appointed, it is normal that they've been through the process. This is a separate issue. I understand that they would have been through developed vetting as a normal part of their appointment before that. But in those cases, is it usual to have a series of mitigations and then be working through the mitigations? Is it normal in other circumstances, or is this very unusual?
I hope this is not in itself a breach, but I was revising for myself the department's own internal guidance on this, which is available to anyone going through the vetting process. What it says is, where we do find a risk, we always try to manage it through our aftercare programme or risk mitigation. So that is standard process for all applicants and holders of DV. So the process I'm describing to you was not some special one we invented for Mandelson. It's a completely standard part of the consideration of granting DV.
Okay, thank you. So then my final question's about the most recent part of the process. So the moments that the Prime Minister talked about, those moments when he felt he should have been told more, that when he went to the House of Commons and to Prime Minister's questions and others, those moments when the unusual parts of the process, not the internal parts of the security vetting that should be rightly kept secret, but the outcome of that and the fact that it was not a straightforward process. So first, when you had the vetting process advice in January 2025. Second, when Mandelson was sacked in September and the Prime Minister gave a statement to Parliament, and that there were press comments that Mandelson had failed his vetting. It was beginning to be the heavy pressure on what happened actually in the process. Then third and fourth, when you appeared before us in November and that you wrote to the chair of this committee. Fifth, there was PMQs and the humble address debate on the 4th of February. And then sixth, the response to the humble address debate on the 16th of March. Every single time it was either the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister or another minister making a statement who had to stand up in front of the House of Commons and other places to justify the process going on. Was it your same decision every single time that the due process had been followed and that's the only thing that should be disclosed? Or did you receive advice during that time from security specialists, from propriety specialists? We've already talked about legal advice, that the decision to withhold the information about the vetting outcome should remain the same, or did it change through that time? Did you receive further advice?
It's a great question. Do you mind a slightly long answer? Because there's a lot here. So I'm afraid, not least because my memory is not good enough, going to go through all of those 6 instances. But the fundamental here is that as we prepared the joint letter that the Foreign Secretary and I sent to the Chair back on the 16th of September, and in parallel, Stephen Doughty's briefing for his appearance in the House of Commons the same day, to take one example, we prepared all of that, not just in consultation with the Cabinet Office and Number 10, but as I recall it, with Number 10 telling us that we needed to make definitively clear that ministers and Number 10 were not involved in the vetting process in any way. Now, that's not designed to be outrageous to me. That was exactly what I expected. That was exactly the basis on which I have been operating the process since I was appointed Permanent Undersecretary, and is consistent, I hope, with my evidence both in November and to you today. So as we then worked to satisfy the need of Parliament, of this committee, for as much as we could safely give, we always had that in the back of our minds, and we had it, I thought, with the confidence of knowing that that was understood to be the position between us, ministers, and Number 10. And so it shouldn't, I hope, then come as a surprise to think that at each of these junctures, I'm not, one scapegoat for this is enough. But I have seen, I remember there being not a single dissenting voice amongst my senior team, my security team, my personnel team, that we were taking exactly the right approach. And I certainly don't remember being challenged about it by ministers.
There was no indication that you should seek legal advice, as has subsequently been done and able to give to the Prime Minister. That it wasn't the whole truth that that Peter Mandelson had just passed the vetting process. The whole truth was that there were concerns along the way. You couldn't reveal any of those concerns, but there were concerns. They were looked into, and then he passed his vetting. There was no consideration that could have been a more full, complete version of events.
There was nothing unique about that situation, Ms. Anderson, if I may say so. As I've tried to explain, the way DV is a risk judgment, and DV depends then quite often on the management and mitigation of those risks. And that's the internal guidance I read out to you earlier is absolutely clear about that. The objective of the system is not to discover things about people and trip them up. It's to encourage the applicant to be open and make full and frank disclosure of potential vulnerabilities, and then, if possible, find ways of managing them. And if we turn DV into a pass-fail piety test, what we end up doing is robbing the British state of a lot of very, very capable people with complicated lives and potential vulnerabilities. And I really, really don't want that for the sake of this country. If anything, this government needs to be served by an ever-increasing range of people with broad experience and interesting lives, not suddenly find that the only people we can employ in sensitive roles are ones who raise no issues whatsoever.
It's interesting, Sir Ollie. I mean, there's interesting and Peter Mandelson's life and the threats that he may have had to the British state. And, I mean, that's really the nub of this. Is how on earth did this happen?
The things that you might say are interesting, sorry, I can't quite shake 20 years in Whitehall, the things you might say are interesting, Chair, I mean, I would contend that those were very, very well known, and they were very well known at the point at which the Cabinet Office produced pre-appointment due diligence work for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister settled on his nominee, he recommended it to the King, he announced it to the public, and then he asked the US government for agrément to his nominee as Ambassador to Washington. So I could agree with you, but I don't think there's not a sort of big surprise in the fact that Peter Mandelson had an interesting life. What I say to you still is that DV is for a different purpose. It's to establish vulnerabilities that lead to an unmanageable risk to UK national security. That's the process, I hope, that we undertook in good faith.
But you see, this doesn't stack up, does it? Because in the end, he lost his job because he was a threat. And that should have been revealed with the DV. He was leaking secrets from the British state to a foreign bank. That's pretty serious.
With respect,
during a time of an economic crash. Somebody must have known about that. Some spook somewhere knew that. That's what DV is supposed to be about, isn't it?
That was not known at the time of his withdrawal, to my knowledge. Certainly it wasn't publicly known, it wasn't known in records available to me or to others in the Foreign Office. What was known was that the basis on which the Prime Minister thought he had received assurances from Mandelson about those connections from his past life with Epstein, the Prime Minister can speak for himself, but I remember him visibly angry that in his view he'd been deceived about those connections. That was the point at which he required of me to withdraw Mandelson from Washington, and it was a very difficult day of my professional life, but I think the Prime Minister did the right thing.
I'm going to go to Edward and then to Alan, if that's all right.
Thank you, Chair. So, Ollie, to that point, the Prime Minister in his statement yesterday to the House said, "Let me be clear, the recommendation in Peter Mandelson's case could and should have been shared with me before he took up his post. Let me make a second point. If I had known before Peter Mandelson took up his post that the UK SV recommendation that developed vetting clearance should be denied, I would not have gone ahead with the appointment." That can't be accurate, given that you have said, given that he was effectively on his way to Washington at the point at which you were making a decision on whether or not the recommendation of UKSV could be mitigated. They had already made the announcement by then. They had already done the due diligence and seen, the Prime Minister had supposedly seen the summary of the report of the due diligence in your conversation with him. So that is, the Prime Minister's statement yesterday is inconsistent with the evidence that you have given today. Do you have a view on whether or not his statement was accurate yesterday?
I'm not here to attack the Prime Minister, Mr. Morello. I'm here to help the committee. And what I want to say to you is that, given the emphasis rightly in this meeting in this session on record keeping, given I was not in post at the time, I can only go on the record. And all I would observe is that I don't doubt that the Prime Minister is saying that sincerely. It would be nice if the record showed that he had required his office and his team to make that stipulation more explicitly clear to those of us who were then charged with trying to make this happen.
They had already made the decision to push ahead in the absence of the UKSV having completed their process. So the idea that you can say, I wouldn't have done it if I'd known the results of the UKSV, while at the same time imposing a process in which the UKSV could never have been completed in time for him to take up that post. Those two things cannot both be true.
I see what you're driving at, Mr. Morello, but just to focus on the chronology for a second, I think in many ways, to a diplomat, one of the most significant steps in this process was pushing the US administration for agrément. I'm sorry it's such a pompous phrase, but that is important in the world of diplomacy. And so in that narrow sense, you're right, that we, on the government's behalf, were pushing for the Prime Minister's nominee to receive agrément before the UKSV process, let alone final clearance, had been given. But we did not deploy him to Washington and grant him a contract until he had obtained vetting. And so the bit of this process, I would say, that the Foreign Office absolutely could and did control was, and this stems from the stance my predecessor took as well, is that he could only serve as ambassador in Washington if he had an extant DV clearance, and that was obtained in time.
I want to go back to Alan, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your time today, Sir Ollie. I'm going to take us to the last couple of days and weeks. The Cabinet Office obtained the vetting file on the 25th of March. Had you been resisting sharing that, or part of some push to stop the Prime Minister from seeing relevant information, potentially as part of some cover-up?
I should say, before I go any further, it's nice of the committee to keep thanking me for my time. My diary is wide open. On the point you make, which is obviously, sorry for the levity, that is a very serious point. We were having these debates between Cabinet Office, Foreign Office, other departments as well, though they should speak for themselves. Obviously, in the aftermath of the humble address, the wording of the humble address motion is honestly a bit inconclusive about exactly what Parliament wanted of the government in connection with vetting. Vetting is raised, but in a rather oddly specific context, I can say now as a non-official. And so there was a live conversation involving us, Cabinet Office and others about what that scope really meant and how we might satisfy it. I would not resile for a second from the Foreign Office's position in that conversation, and I'm not trying to hide from it. I certainly held this view, but I was also advised it was the correct view, and others in the Foreign Office took it too, and we were not alone in Whitehall in taking this position, was that, for all the reasons I have gone on about this morning, that to open that box is to do something that has long-term damaging and chilling implications for UK national security. And yeah, I will not hide from the fact that my department, including me, took that view in those internal discussions. But you said didn't want to share. We did not own the material. So this was a debate about whether the Cabinet Office opened their own safe. And in the end, they chose to do so. I would still have wished that they didn't, not because of what's happened to me, but because of all of the factors I've tried to lay out for you this morning. And consistently, we continue to advise that they shouldn't. I think at various points in this story, though, of course, they will speak for themselves, they were quite convinced by that view. I certainly recall being debriefed on meetings with the Cabinet Office in which they had been very worried about the implications of opening the box, and indeed, I think, again, they'll speak for themselves, but had discussed some of that openly with the ISC as part of the humble address follow-up. So, I'm not putting words in your mouth, Mr. Gemmell, but this was certainly not a question of Cabinet Office having one firm view, sunshine is the best, blah, blah, blah. Foreign Office says absolutely not, because we own the file and we're terribly secretive about it. They own the file. We thought that the government and national security was best protected by trying to stick to the principles that I've described to you this morning. That was not just my personal view, but that was the strong view of my senior team.
Thank you. Yesterday in the House, the Prime Minister said that officials in the Foreign Office saw fit to withhold information on Mandelson's vetting from the most senior ministers in our system. Is that how you see it?
No.
Once the problem that Number 10 had identified became apparent, what conversations did you have with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary or the Cabinet Secretary that you'd be able to share with us today?
You mean in the last few days?
In the last few days.
This is where I must plead one of the caveats from my letter, if I may, Mr. Gemmell. I think, given the way I have been treated over the last few days, I've been obviously thinking very hard about this session, thinking about how I hope do my duty to Parliament in thinking these issues through. I've not yet really had a chance to focus on the letter I received yesterday and what on earth I do about it. All I would say is I regret that I, in my view, didn't have some of the points that the Prime Minister and others are making about the Foreign Office's decision-making and about my accountability. I regret that those were not put to me before I received a letter dismissing me.
In those conversations, were you able to set out how the Foreign Office does vetting? And do you think people understood these distinctions that you've been making today?
I've certainly tried to set them out, but as I'm straying too far. I think what I've tried to offer you today, Mr. Gemmell, and the committee, is that I think a lot of the things that have been said about the system over the last couple of days are, to put it kindly, a bit misguided. And I've tried to be, I know it's complicated, I know it's full of jargon, it is a vital system for the protection of this country, and I hope I have laid it out clearly and honestly.
Do you have concerns about the amount of information we've now shared about our developed vetting system in relation to what our adversaries know about us?
Yes, I am. I think that it may sound paranoid, but I think even the level of disclosure that the government has offered over the last few days, British national security does not benefit from this, so we have to ask whose does.
I may be paraphrasing Afra's question, but you have been at the centre of government for many years and spent many years of your career promoting and defending our country's national security. With the benefit of hindsight, when you hear the committee's questions today on notes, on taking advice, on how the Foreign Office took this decision, and ending up putting someone who leaked some of the most, who had in their past leaked some of the most sensitive secrets this country has, with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything different in relation to the appointment of Peter Mandelson?
Anything different? That's very sweeping, Mr. Gemmell. I've tried to be open. There are various aspects of this system I think could be improved, and maybe I wish I'd had the time to offer that as a general view about the way we operate the system at various points in my tenure. But I think in the way you generously asked the question, what I reflect on most is that the British state is dissecting itself to some extent in public over this. I understand why, and this morning I've tried now as a private citizen to support that process. I do reflect honestly on my wonderful colleagues who are sat in the British Embassy in Moscow or the British Embassy in Beijing and are subjected to incredible pressure. And the way I try to lead them and support them during my time as PUS. And of course, I find myself wondering who this helps.
Thank you.
Very good. We've just got a couple of questions from people who promised me they have one question each, so I'm going to keep them to it. Dan.
Thanks, Chair. So, Ollie, you are one of the country's most distinguished civil servants, and you have this week been dismissed by the Prime Minister. Can you tell us why? Is it your contention that you have delivered your duty, you've carried out security vetting in the usual procedural way, and what is your reaction to the way you've been treated this week? And I suppose finally, what impact will it have on your colleagues?
Thank you. Again, Mr. Carden, thank you for the generous way you asked the question, but I should be careful here. The very short answer is I don't fully understand the reasons that I'm in the position I am in, but that is for a separate process for me to try to get to the bottom of. As a human being, I'm desperately, desperately sad about it, Mr. Carden. I love that job. I love that institution. I was proud to serve this government and any government that might follow it. I hope I was doing it to the best of my ability. I was certainly doing it as hard as I possibly could. I had wonderful colleagues who I miss deeply. And the issues we were dealing with, and my colleagues are still dealing with, are of profound importance to the success of this government and the success of the country. It's been the proudest part of my career to lead that institution because of their work, not because of mine. And you say kind things about my distinguished career. I just feel intensely proud of the people I've led, and I wish them every success and wish I could still be with them.
Thank you. And thank you for that answer to my honourable friend here. Yesterday, the Prime Minister was asked by the member for New Forest East, before sacking Oliver Robbins last week, did the Prime Minister ask him why he overruled the verdict of security vetters, and if so, what was his explanation? The Prime Minister replied, "I did ask him, and I did not accept his explanation. That is why I sacked him." Did the Prime Minister ask you, and what about your explanation do you think he did not agree with?
It's a very legitimate question, Ms. Brandreth. The reason I wrote to the committee ahead of this hearing on this matter is I'm afraid, given I'm in unknown territory, honestly, for me personally, about the HR position I am in and what this means for my family, I must remain quiet on that until my advisors have told me what the appropriate thing to do is about it. All I would say in echoing the Chair's opening remarks is I hope I have been completely transparent as far as I can be in my understanding of process, guidance and precedent at every stage in this, and I wish I had been given more opportunities given the confusion that clearly exists to explain the process in more detail.
But is it fair to say that he did ask you?
I must reserve my position on that, if I may, because I think I will get into a situation where I'm saying things to this committee that I may need to rely on later.
Sir John.
Thank you. The Cabinet Office has been tasked with fulfilling the requirements of the humble address. Are you confident that that is being fulfilled to the letter, or are you aware of any other documents that have not yet been published which might help explain what has happened?
Well, my team obviously were closely involved with the Cabinet Office in trying to satisfy the terms of the humble address over the last couple of months of my tenure in the job. It is maybe now I'm released, I can be slightly more open about this. Is a very, very hard motion to sensibly satisfy, if I may say so, to you as members of the House of Commons, because at its extreme, its wording, which requires us to offer up all electronic communications between Mandelson and pretty much anyone in the government system, could be anything from an intelligence report to a room booking. And so what we have been working through for the last couple of months is how on earth to interpret that in a way that satisfies the underlying, clearly legitimate, the government voted for it, desire of Parliament to understand more about the circumstances surrounding Mandelson, with not actually creating an unmanageable burden and frankly unmanageable national security risk for the operation of our diplomatic service. So I don't think today, sadly, it's for me to explain how the Foreign Office is working with the Cabinet Office to try to manage that, but I hope it helps my colleagues and indeed ministers left behind in the system to explain that that was a very, very difficult thing to work through.
And are you aware of any documents which actually would be highly relevant to this matter that haven't been released?
So there are clearly documents related to the terms of the motion that have not yet been released, because the release that's been made so far is I think, a relatively small proportion of what the government could choose to release in this process. There is obviously the ISC process in respect of international relations and national security, as you'll be aware, and I think there's a live dialogue, again, obviously now pleading that I'm no longer part of it, but a live dialogue between Cabinet Office, Foreign Office and ISC about how to manage that weight of material.
That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in and for answering our questions. I hope that the questions that we've asked have covered the sort of questions that the public will also want to have had answers to, given how important this matter has become. And thank you for your time. And what I'd like to do is if you wouldn't mind, the press and the public could remain seated, and then if you're able to leave first, and then we'll release press and public after that. But I'm going to now finish the proceedings. Thank you very much.